Christianity is not something that goes on between your ears. It's not just a way of thinking, it's a way of life. And that's where we're turning to a new phase of our meeting together, and it's my joy and my privilege to introduce to you Loretta Minghella. Loretta is the first Church Estates Commissioner, which sounds terribly imposing. If the church is a school for the Lord's service, you could think of the role as being a bit like being the chair of governors in some ways. It's to do with governance, it's to do with the health of the lot. As a layperson who has worked in various fields, Loretta began with a legal background, went into the whole world of financial regulation. She has walked with dinosaurs, including nasty toothy ones, as well as big lumpy ones. And she's now landed the biggest and lumpiest dinosaur of the lot, which is being the first Church Estates Commissioner. The way in which our resources are used, the way of life that we resource, and our calling in Christ to a life of love and compassion that is real, not just good ideas. If we are not going to hide our resources away in a hanky, what are we going to do? These are things which need to be thought through in a very disciplined way, and enormous amounts of loving attention goes into this. So as we turn to reflecting on our call to compassion in Christ, we've invited Loretta to help us see how all the things that we feel called to in Christ can become real as compassion in the communities we serve. So thank you very much indeed, Loretta. It's a joy to welcome you here today.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a privilege to be asked, and lovely to be asked to do something with your diocese again, and the first time since Bishop Stephen's in his new role. So thank you so much for asking me. I hope by the end of this you feel more able to access your own compassion, and that if you even a slightly tiny bit, that's great, and if not, that you at least feel compassionate towards me. When the war broke out in 1939, my grandfather left his wife of 16 years and their 3 girls, including my 9-year-old mother, and went to Ireland. His claim that given his Italian origins, he feared he was vulnerable to internment despite his British citizenship was completely made up. His promise that he would look for a safe haven there and then send for the rest of the family to join him was an empty one. The regular letters explaining that finding a place for them or coming home instead were both too difficult for now gave them false hope. Why he lied to them for years remains unclear. Perhaps initially he didn't want to hurt them, perhaps he was ashamed, I'm not sure. The simple truth was that he loved another woman and had chosen the opportunity the war afforded him to leave his family to be with her. That only became plain to my mother in 1944, when she was sent aged 14 with her sister to visit him in Dublin with a view to a family visit to ask the consul to allow him a safe passage home. It was there that he told his girls, without any evident regret, that he had no intention of returning, that he did not like where they lived in Glasgow, and that he had never loved their mother. The reality of his abandonment of them became suddenly and searingly clear. Towards the end of her life, my mother would often return to this story, describe in detail the shock, the humiliation, and the pain of it, as though it were only yesterday. My grandfather lived with his new partner in Dublin for over 20 years. He had at various points turned up in the Isle of Wight, to where my grandmother had moved with her girls, to give his daughter away to be married, to attend our baptisms, and, it seems, to take a few quid out of the till in our family cafe before taking himself off again. He knew he could get away with it because my grandmother never stopped loving him. When he died in 1963, my grandmother insisted that she and my mother go immediately to Dublin to see him. In her grief, she walked straight into the house in which he'd lived with his new partner all those years and into their bedroom. She threw herself down on the bed beside his body and declared, "My darling, I've always loved you. I forgive you everything." And she begged his father, from whom he'd been estranged because of the disgrace of his affair, she begged his father to allow him a space in the family grave in Scotland, on condition that she be allowed to be buried beside him when she died. And she was indeed buried beside him in 1975. My grandmother and my mother were both women of great faith. And as a child, I was brought up in the Catholic Church alongside them, but drifted away in my late teens. But then 16 years ago, I discovered what compassion really feels like. There was a simple invitation. My daughter, aged 8, had a friend for a sleepover. And the friend's parents said, "In the morning, don't bring our daughter back to our house. On Sunday morning, we go to church. She sings in the choir. She needs to be there at 9:30 for a service at 10. Please bring her there, and you can stay if you like." My daughter said to me, "Mum, why don't we go and see what it's like?" And I said, "Okay." We walked into St Barnabas Dulwich. The music started. And then I knew for the first time what it means to be fully known and fully welcomed and fully loved. I felt in one sense liberated, unburdened, and in another sense hugely vulnerable. I didn't admit it to anyone for a while, hid behind the pretext of needing to accompany my daughter, who straight away jumped in and said, "I want to join in here." I pretended I was going in order to be with her. After all, what self-respecting, non-religious, highly analytical, pretty successful financial services lawyer had anything other than a wholly rational experience on a Sunday morning, if it isn't some kind of midlife aberration? No one I knew. I'd spent many years thinking of all my religious colleagues at work that I knew about, very few as it happens. I thought they were a little bit odd, a little bit sort of God squaddy. And I was married, and indeed am still married, to a card-carrying non-believer. But it had happened to me. An unmistakable encounter, an Emmaus moment. I felt like all this time my headphones had been plugged into the wrong socket, but now they were in the right socket, and I could hear really clearly God faithful to me, there all the time, despite my decades in the wilderness, a compassionate God saying, "I've always loved you. I forgive you everything." Those on the margins, the adulteress about to be stoned, the bleeding woman who touched Jesus' cloak, the woman at the well, Mary pouring the oil over Jesus' feet. These women were all at the margins, as I had felt coming into church that day. At the margins in a secular context, but at the margins in a church context too, I could now see God's grace in Jesus' encounters with these 4 women. Jesus spent his time in the margins, in the toughest places. Why wouldn't he have compassion for me? And stories that I knew from my school days began to make real sense. Those 3 parables running together in Luke, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, the great message that each one of us matters, that the 99 needs to be 100, that the last coin needs searching for, that my Father, compassion personified in Jesus Christ, will come running over the fields to meet me. compassion. What have we done with it? We're a thirsty people in a dry and weary land. We live in such worrying times. Despite all the inroads we've made in the last 20, 30 years in the problem of extreme poverty, 700 million people are still living below the extreme poverty line, now standing at $1.90 a day. No prizes for guessing that a significant majority of these people are women and girls. Perhaps a few prizes for noting that the majority too are not to be found in the poorest countries, but in the middle-income countries like Brazil and India, because inequality, driven by discrimination on the grounds of race, creed, colour, gender, sexuality and disability, inequality is the main driver of poverty. A profound and global failure to love each other unconditionally just because we are. We live in worrying times, and it feels like dangerous times. If I predicted a few years ago that by 2018 the United States of America would have elected a person without any prior experience of political office as their president, you might not have believed me. If I'd said that that person would boast that not paying his taxes made him smart, who claimed that climate change was a hoax invented by the Chinese, and that he'd sexually assaulted women essentially because his celebrity gave him the opportunity on a plate, well, I'm sure you would have thought I was losing my judgment. In the very recent past, what we've come to understand is the huge inequalities and discriminations that sit behind disasters like Grenfell, or the Windrush deportations, or the rise of anti-Semitism in our own nation. These episodes and trends reflect badly on how power is flowing here at home, and the nerve gas used in Salisbury, the chemical weapons used in Syria, the criminal harvesting of private data for political campaigning, the trashing of expertise, the rise of fake news. There are forces at work globally which are enormously powerful in a disruptive and very harmful way. And for anyone like us, people who are serious about a more just and peaceful world, there's much in these recent events to be alarmed about. I meet so many people overwhelmed, bewildered, depressed by what they see. A neighbour told me recently, I'm terrified by what's happening. I'm so sad about the war, climate change, starvation, xenophobia, financial, political instability. I've just stopped watching the news. That's all I can do. The stories around international aid only reinforce her concern. Can we really trust the aid sector to make a difference? For her, compassion fatigue has really taken hold. Compassion is often instinctive, and at a time when it's more necessary than ever, when to so many important questions it is the answer, in so many places we seem to have shut it down. So how do we reclaim compassion for our times? I'd say that we have to recognise it for what it is, distinguish it from what it isn't, understand the conditions in which it thrives and what thwarts it, and practice, practice, practice until it becomes instinctive again, and repeat as necessary. What do we mean by compassion? It's a rich and dense concept. I did, in fact, go back to the full Oxford Dictionary. I will spare you an etymological exploration and say for working purposes, I want to start with the simple translation, suffering with. Not sympathy or pity, which implies more feeling sorry for someone, nor empathy or altruism, which do involve identifying with people or putting their needs first, but again, not necessarily associated with suffering, nor philanthropy, which often seems more about the giver than the one who needs. To get our minds more around the notion of compassion as suffering with and the conditions in which it thrives, I want to dive further into my own experience, because I have seen what I know to be compassion and what I know to be the absence of compassion, and I will start in that more negative territory. One of the great joys of my life was spending 7.5 years as the Chief Executive of Christian Aid, running Christian Aid's programmes across the world. And one of the great joys of doing that job was the chance I got to travel around the world to see the amazing work of staff and partners in the communities we worked with on the ground. Every time I went anywhere, there was always some kind of security flare-up in the country I was about to visit, most commonly riots, not, I think, caused by me. It's at such times that I was grateful for the brilliant security training we got to prepare us should the worst happen. Sadly, kidnapping of aid workers is becoming much more commonplace, so I'm especially glad that I had some training about how to conduct myself if it happened to me. Apparently, the key thing to remember is to try to strike up a relationship with your kidnappers, because then they find it harder to maintain the distance that's required to treat you as badly as they otherwise might. I travelled with pictures of my family on my phone. I carried them for comfort, but I knew they might also prove useful if I was ever taken on a journey I hadn't been planning on. When I visited Cambodia to see some of Christian Aid's work there, I visited Tuol Sleng, the school in Phnom Penh taken over by the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s and used as a place to imprison and then kill about 20,000 Cambodian people. The museum on site now houses walls of individual photographs of the people held there, taken as they were admitted, each wearing their own number in large print. Each person catalogued against this number. Their height carefully measured too, presumably so that they could be tortured and executed, not as a person, but as a set of statistics. 10 so-called security regulations for behaviour within Tuol Sleng are still displayed outside. Security regulation number 6 reads as follows: while getting lashes or electrification, you must not cry at all. This is the kind of involved infrastructure of systematic dehumanisation and disconnection which provided a grotesquely effective framework in which to take so many lives. Because it is so instinctive to feel compassion in the face of suffering, it has to be suppressed, and it's suppressed by deep bureaucracy. For compassion requires attentiveness to the reality of the experience of the other, and it requires an open and tender-heartedness, an undefendedness from the truth. In short, it requires connection. The same week I visited Tuol Sleng, I sat under a tree in a compound in Phnom Penh and talked with a 14-year-old girl who had been raped. Alas, it's very common for girls to be the victim of domestic and sexual violence there, because the deep poverty in the area means they're often at the mercy of unscrupulous employers or prospective employers. We partnered at the time with the Cambodian Women Crisis Centre, where she was being looked after, so I wanted to find out what she thought of the help she was getting to bring legal charges, to get compensation, to get counselling and training, and then some help to find a job afterwards. I told her I didn't need to know what had happened to her before she arrived. No need to tell me about that, I said. She could tell that I was in deeply analytical chief executive mode. But you do need to know, she said, you really do need to know. And I do have to tell you, because then you will understand what is happening here. And she proceeded to share with me details I really wish I didn't know, which were intensely private and no doubt so difficult to share. She made herself so vulnerable to me so that I would never forget her and would want to make sure that Christian Aid didn't stop fighting for a world in which violence and discrimination against women and girls, universally commonplace and a driver of so much poverty, is a thing of the past. The awesome power of her purposeful vulnerability softened my heart again. To keep our minds open to the reality of suffering, to suffer with. We can read a lot of dry articles, digest the statistics, but to recognize our sameness, our shared humanity with those who suffer, to be compassionate, we have to get alongside those in pain, at least metaphorically alongside them. We have to hear their stories, feel their suffering. There is no such thing as dispassionate compassion. And it can take real courage to face the pain of the suffering of others full on. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. I'm going to pause there for a moment so you don't have to just listen to me. And I want you to turn to someone close by and ponder 3 questions with them. Do you feel your own capacity for compassion under pressure at the moment? And why is that? How do you keep yourself informed about need, not just about the facts of it, but the reality of it, the human consequences, not just in the parish, but across the nation, across the world? And the third question, how hard do you find it to look the reality of suffering in the eye? I'm going to leave you with those questions between you for a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted. Thank you. I'm delighted that you found... Oh. I'm delighted that you found plenty to talk about there, and I'm sorry to interrupt your conversations, but maybe hold those thoughts and pick them up afterwards. I hope it's been helpful to reflect a little on how to keep really tuned in to what people are experiencing. Because people in need very often feel ashamed about their situation, and the stigma of it is often one of the hardest things for them to bear, even when they've done nothing wrong. I was talking to a woman at church last week who's new, and we talked about our weeks ahead, and I said, I'm going up to Derbyshire to speak to the Oxford Diocese about compassion. What does it mean to you? So it was an icebreaker with someone you don't know, and she said, well... And she actually said, well, I only just met her. I suffer from depression. And compassion to me, someone with mental illness, is to be recognised and seen and not judged. When we show that we've really seen and recognised a person, that we honour their reality, that we don't shy away from it, that we don't judge them for it, that act of compassion can be transformational for them. And I go a bit further and tentatively suggest this, that a compassionate person is also willing to be seen, is willing really to show up in a relationship, and that the deepest compassion requires mutual recognition. Jesus showed us the way of compassion throughout his ministry, but in looking again at two stories I often turn to, I noticed only recently that this mutual recognition plays an important role. I've got a soft spot for Zacchaeus because I'm quite short. In Luke 19, when he climbs the tree, because he couldn't see Jesus because he was very short. The local people obviously didn't like him because he worked for the Romans. We can also imagine that self-consciousness he had about being a shorty, someone who's got lots of reasons to hide, but who allows himself to be seen. Someone who had, we are told, already started to show compassion, started to give away his wealth, perhaps a less visible step, but now who risked the great disapproval or ridicule of the crowd by showing himself, looking for Jesus, rather than hiding away. And he's rewarded, as Jesus said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. He has recognized Jesus, and Jesus openly recognizes him. And likewise, the woman in Luke chapter 8, who we hear has been bleeding for 12 years and couldn't be healed, and who everyone shuns. She has this enormous audacity, not to climb a tree this time, but to do that forbidden thing, to touch him. Just to touch Jesus, even though she is a person who may not touch or be touched, because she believes he has the power to heal her, which he does. And then, as we read, he asks whoever touched him to reveal herself, which she doesn't need to do, but she does. She comes trembling, falling down before him, declaring in the presence of all the people why she touched him and how she'd been immediately healed. And we know, he tells her, that her faith had made her well and to go in peace. And here are the crucial words from that passage that I've only noticed recently. And when the woman saw she was not hidden, she came forward. No one else could have known that she was the bleeding woman who'd been healed immediately. She could have kept quiet, but she embraced the knowledge that she herself was fully known, and that knowledge gave her the courage to witness to her faith in Jesus and know her life to be forever transformed. She recognized Jesus and he recognized her, and that recognition he made sure was publicly known. It was the public connection between them that was transformational, not just for her, but for those around them. Through her witness and through her allowing Jesus publicly to recognize her, others came to know the saving love of Christ. This models for me the compassionate love we are commanded to show for every neighbour. God showing up in the presence of Jesus Christ, seeing us for who we are, offering us his whole self, offering us everything he has to give, and arms wide on the cross. To the last he shows compassion. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Human to human in these encounters in Luke, he shows that in the relationship into which we're all called, each one made in the image of God and loved for who we are, we're all the same. On my very first field visit for Christian Aid in 2010, I travelled to Kenya, to the slums outside Nairobi, to see some of our sanitation work there. I met Evelyn, spokeswoman for her community in the Matapeni slum. Her family had moved from a rural area of Kenya to Nairobi, victims of a changing climate which had made farming unproductive and ultimately unsustainable. The community lacked a clean water supply, any functioning toilets or showers. Sewage washed into the slum huts when it rained, and disease was rife. I struggled, to be honest, going in there. I'd heard about it, but the reality was something different altogether. Evelyn led me by the hand around the slum, helped me avoid slipping off the planks into the non-operative drains. Finally, she invited me into her home, a hut not much bigger than her garden shed, 9 people living there. It stank of kerosene, an expensive fuel used for cooking associated with respiratory problems, burns, and house fires. It was very dark. 4 eyes peered out from the darkness, 2 young boys, too hungry to walk to school. In a bed in the corner dying, Evelyn's father, no longer able to afford the £12 a time he needed for his cancer treatment. I ventured a simple question: what's your biggest worry at the moment? A short silence. I prayed I'd be up to hearing the answer. More silence. Perhaps she was praying she'd be up to telling me. A vulnerable moment for us both. And then Evelyn, eyes to the floor, started to explain her difficulty. How her father was worried, they were all worried. She was unmarried and wanted to preserve herself. But at the moment, she didn't know how they would afford to bury her father, which she realised was an imminent requirement. It took me a while to understand her meaning, that she was contemplating the imminent possibility of trading her virginity to pay to bury her own father. I asked her how she kept going. She said her faith kept her going, that each morning she thanked God for bringing her through another night and giving her another day. and that she'd received some paralegal training. These are her words. I've received some paralegal training. I'm now a community advisor, which, although I'm not paid, it gives me a lot of pleasure because I can help others in the community with their own problems. I told her I was a lawyer as well, and she gave me this gift. So you see, she said, we are the same. And we held hands in the dark for quite a long time and contemplated our sameness and our connectedness. Recognition and connection are necessary for compassion, but they're not sufficient. That could be more like pity than compassion. Compassion calls us to step up. It's more than a feeling, it's a call to action, not just to suffer with a person, but to relieve that suffering. And I would observe that the most inspiring acts of compassion involve acts of solidarity in the middle of the suffering. I was taught this most keenly by another woman I met in Phnom Penh, a tiny woman in her 70s who'd been jailed the year before for standing at the front of a large march singing hymns in protest about land which had been wrongly taken from her community. She still had her own house, but others were suffering, having lost theirs. She was showing her love and compassion for them. Presumably just because she was at the front, the riot police took an electric baton to her in front of the crowd and jailed her for 30 days. I met with her in her home, which is now a safe place for others still getting together and protesting about the taking of their land, trying to get proper compensation for the loss of shelter and livelihoods. On the way to see her, I saw the park full of black lumps, like huge black beetles neatly on the ground in rows. Riot gear, helmets, body armour, gloves, batons, row upon row, waiting to be deployed at the demonstrations predicted in the week I was there. The risks to her were obvious. Her vulnerability was clear. But that hadn't stopped her trying to get what her neighbours needed. She was clear with me that she would continue to speak up and protest as necessary. If there's horror in the brutality she experienced, there is beauty in her protest, in her compassion. The community loves her for it, is fortified by it. In a bleak situation, it gives them hope. In her willingness to stand at the front, take the inevitable risk of it, she reminds me of Jesus in front of Pilate, offering no defence. His compassion and purposeful vulnerability, so awesome, so terrifying, they have to kill him for it. Hers too. Her vulnerability is so powerful, it has to be crushed first. I'm going to give you a few minutes break from that now. I know it's tough stuff. I want you to reflect on whether you agree with me about compassion requiring us to see and be seen. Being recognised in that common humanity. Is it your experience? Is it part of why compassion is tough? I'll leave you with that thought for a couple of minutes. Okay, thank you. We started a bit late, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to take this last section as quickly as I can. But it's something that I think doesn't always spring to mind when we think about compassion, because I think when we think about compassion, we think about, relatively small and private and intimate moments. But I believe in compassionate advocacy, and I want to talk about advocacy now. I think this is one of the most courage, I think that you need a lot of courage to be compassionate, because you do have to show up, you do have to expose yourself, you do have to be vulnerable. And it's hard to look your own frailties in the eye. Rowan Williams says, acknowledge who you are. That's the truest heroism and the hardest. And I think he's right about that. And I think compassion pushes us out of our comfort zone, where we would normally be silent and hope that others speak up, where speaking up needs to be done. I think compassion often calls us to speak up for those in need, to be an intercessor for those in need. And each one of us here can do this, especially if we get informed. You can let it be known that you think poverty and inequality are not okay, that violence is not okay, that discrimination is not okay, fake news is not okay, tax dodging is not okay, climate change is not okay. Every time you use your position to speak out on these issues and encourage others to do the same, you give a signal that compassionate advocacy matters, that intercession matters, and courage grows, and voice matters more. And I would say one of the things that holds people back is a lack of confidence in their own voice, a lack of confidence that will make a difference. But when we all gather together around a common cause, we really can change things. And I think another thing that gets in the way of being a compassionate advocate is feeling like you have to know the answer to protest an injustice or to ask a question. I want to share with you one of the most powerful stories. I think it's really a story that's changed many hearts. And it comes from a visit that I made to the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. Typhoon Haiyan struck there in 2013. Over 6,000 people died. Over 6 million people were forced from their homes. And 18 months on, I found high-quality, well-kept transitional housing in place, people beginning to earn a living again, no longer just relying on handouts. And when I visited Tacloban, which was one of the places hardest hit, I was welcomed by hundreds of genuinely smiling and grateful people. But it took only the gentlest of questions for those smiles to evaporate and for the tales of trauma to rush out. They told me about how, when the typhoon had struck, a body of water 6 meters high had come crashing on shore and picked them up and swept them in. And they were carried along in this body of water. And one woman told me that she had been caught up in it and found herself swimming along with her 4 children in the water, swimming along. And she had to keep on swimming. And the children were calling to her, "Mum, how long do we have to keep on swimming? Mum, how long do we have to keep on swimming?" And she was saying, "Just a bit longer, just a bit longer." "How long, Mum? Just a bit longer." "How long? Just a bit longer." How? What might she have asked me then? She needed so much. She'd been through so much. She asked me one challenging question. What are you doing about climate change? Because she knows, and I know, that climate change is making extreme weather events like Typhoon Haiyan more and more likely. Without urgent and radical action to cut carbon emissions, it will only be a matter of time before another massive typhoon strikes. Everywhere I travelled to see Christian Aid's work, I saw that really, really clearly. I also see poor people really rising to the challenge of doing something about it, including asking duty bearers, "What are you doing about climate change?" And I've told that story to government ministers. I've told that story to business leaders and other NGO leaders, because her question in her situation was a powerful one. A question that, put in context, has moved people to reflect and to commit to change. And it demonstrated to me that the asking of the question can sometimes be the most powerful, the most compassionate thing. Not knowing the answer, but simply standing and interceding can be an act of the greatest compassion. And I didn't need to leave that behind when I left Christian Aid. Indeed, compassionate advocacy, or what we call in the Commissioners engagement, is something that we do at the Church Commissioners with increasing success. Our portfolio of assets means we get meaningful access to the so-called captains of industry and to their AGMs. We get to ask them the tough questions about how businesses are being run. This year, we're majoring on issues around climate change, about the lack of diversity on boards, and around executive pay. One of the most controversial areas of our work is around climate change, because lots of people think the church should just divest from all its fossil fuel-related assets. And indeed, we have already divested from some immediately on the adoption of our new policy in 2015. But for many companies, including the oil majors, we've chosen a path of engagement to get alongside them, to recognise the size of the shift we're asking them to make, but to be clear about the change that we need to see, and it is paying off. And I could speak about it for a long time, but you're waiting for your service, so I'm just going to suggest that here is an example of compassionate advocacy that you can be proud of, the Commissioner's engagement with companies. It's a publication that's on the website. I'll leave a copy with the Bishop when I see him later on. But I think it's a really, really important way the church uses its voice to stand up for the poor and the marginalised, to seek the change that we need, getting alongside, being in relationship, speaking truth to power. Compassion then, I'm coming to the end now, requires knowledge of the reality of the suffering of another person. It requires authenticity of connection in which we too need to allow ourselves to be seen. It calls us irresistibly to action, which may be to highlight the suffering and call for it to be addressed. It connotes a move towards a person and a situation. It involves giving up something which is costly to us: money, our personal safety, our privacy, our comfort zones. It's not to be confused with any thin notion of charity, where giving can be a buffer, enable us to feel that we've done our duty, can get on with our lives. Money in the envelope, tick the box, job done. Compassion has to be an act of real solidarity, or it's not compassion. It's to be done with our sleeves rolled up and our emotional guard down. So when you support Christian Aid Week this year, even though I've left Christian Aid, I will always carry it with me. When you support Christian Aid Week this year, which I know you will, do take the time to really engage with the stories behind the campaign. Stories this year from Haiti, where the need remains great. You will find all the materials you need on the website. There are some actually outside today. And Jenny, will you stand up? We've got Jenny Ayres with us, Christian Aid's head of the South East region. She will be here to answer your questions, help you with materials, but she'll only be here till about 2, so do grab her quickly afterwards. Today, I want to leave you with a story of one of my former colleagues at Christian Aid, Prospery Raymond, the country manager in Haiti. On the last day of my visit to Haiti in 2011, I found myself in Port-au-Prince alone with Prospery. He took me there to see where the Christian Aid office had stood until the day of the earthquake the year before. We stood in front of a large pile of rubble, the dimensions of an office building still just discernible. When the earthquake struck, he was trapped by falling masonry in his office on the ground floor. The first floor collapsed into the ground floor, and much of the ground floor into the ground. Prospery himself was rescued by a group of young boys after an hour and a half, during which time he said he learnt the true meaning of the words "heart in your mouth," because his heartbeat was so loud it appeared to be coming from under his tongue. Having been rescued in such traumatic circumstances, what would you have done? I think I might have gone home at that point. But Prospery set about working with passers-by to rescue another Evelyn, this time a staffer from our Dutch sister agency with whom we shared office space. She was trapped below the ground with only a small opening through which they could see she was seriously hurt. After 7 hours or so, they brought her out by her broken shoulders. I might have gone home at that point. But in the absence of any available ambulance staff, Prospery volunteered to carry her to the hospital. A 30-minute walk in normal circumstances, he found there was no straight path, only a circuitous route, stepping over the dead and walking around the dying. Every so often he'd put her down for a rest, both for her and for him, and people would die round them, and he'd pick her up and start again. Having got her to the hospital, what would you have done? I might have gone home at that point. But Prospery turned round and thought, look what has happened to my country. It's time to mount the Christian aid relief effort. And that's what Prospery did next. The practice of compassion, which for Prospery is second nature, grows a capacity for compassion, which Prospery still has in spades. He's actually visiting your diocese on Friday. So if you speak to Jenny, you can find out where he'll be speaking. He's really, really worth going along to hear. Do not cease then from exploration, but let the end of all your exploring take you back to this place. You are fully known, and yet you are still loved, called forward into relationship with an ever-loving God, under no illusion about your frailties and your shortcomings, but walks alongside you on your Emmaus road, and indeed would like to stay at your house today. His compassion for us is endless, so we don't need to hoard it or ration it. We can afford to give it away, confident that it replenishes a living water. So have courage, show up, and let the world see the great power of the love of God writ large in your compassion and the compassion of his followers everywhere. Thank you for listening.